For some reason, there are 8 GBA Shrek games. 8, like, let that sink in for a moment. 8 Shrek games sounds like a nightmare, let alone 8 Shrek games on the one system, but here I am about to cover them all in order of release with none other than my resident Shrekspert himself, the Golden Bolt.
Okay, first off, never call me that again, and secondly, for anybody who's wondering, we're recording all of these games using the GameCube's GBA player.
Enjoy. Starting with a bang, we have Shrek Kart Speedway, which was developed by the notoriously mediocre TDK Mediactive, who worked on some other Shrek games, and was released in March of 2002, less than a year after the far, far better Mario Kart Super Circuit. It has the same controls as Mario Kart, but to say it controls the same would be a disservice to Mario Kart. Movement isn't completely horrible, but once you start colliding with things, it falls apart entirely. When you hit an opponent, you basically bounce across the road and come to a complete stop, but when they hit you, it's all good and they just fly off into the distance, and I've lost count of the amount of times I kept getting repeatedly jammed into a wall after just nicking my cart on a corner. Both Bolt and I played this and got glitched out in walls while playing this, and it's just amazingly terrible. The word that stuck with me most throughout my entire experience with Shrek Kart Speedway is nauseating. When I first booted it up and played a track, I was met with really choppy graphics that make it hard to distinguish anything, and after playing for a while, I was just sickened by the repetitive music. Hell, when you first open the main menu, you're met with this monstrosity of a song. Yeah, so Swamp Kart Speedway is widely considered to be one of the worst Shrek games, and from my limited Shrek experience, I can agree with that. You can tell it's just really soulless and rushed, like how the items, which are all very standard by the way, they barely animate or have any effects to go with them, so initially learning what they all do is kinda hard, and using them is super unsatisfying. And some of the stages are far, far worse to play than others, just in terms of how badly designed they are and how hard it is to tell what anything you're looking at actually is. Even the rally game style arrows at the top of the screen, which are meant to tell you where to go, often give you the complete opposite direction of the next turn. Like, it's all a mess, and it's at least a kind of funny mess, but hey, it's all upward from here, right? Like, it's not like they could make a worse Shrek racing game or anything.
Next up is Shrek Hassle at the Castle, which is actually the first Shrek game that I looked at in my Shrektober series, a video series where I look at all things Shrek because I hate myself. Released in October 2002, yet again by publisher TDK, Hassle at the Castle is the only of the nearly 30 Shrek games that follows the first film's plot. Naturally, it couldn't be that simple though, so the game is designed with a chibi art style for some godforsaken reason. So as Chibi Shrek, Donkey, and Fiona, you'll travel through a handful of incredibly formulaic quote-unquote platforming levels based on the original Shrek film. For as much as I want to rag on the graphics because of the character sprites, they're definitely not bad, and we will absolutely see worse on this list. The backgrounds and level art are nice enough, although the parallax scrolling in the background is really poorly done and ends up hurting my eyes if I focus on it for more than a moment. Also, there are only like 4 songs in the game, so that's pleasant. Mechanically, the game plays far more like a beat-em-up than a platformer, but it still really wants to be a platformer half the time. That half of the experience totally blows. In most levels, you're limited to Shrek or Donkey, with Fiona appearing as a playable character for only 2 or 3 levels. When she's here though, she's the best character in the game hands down. She moves faster, jumps higher, takes down enemies the fastest, and for some reason her levels are the only ones that feel like they were designed by somebody who's made a platforming game before. That's not to say her levels are actually good or anything, they're still a total mess, but they're the least messy if nothing else. For most of the game, you'll be plodding slowly across the flat, unremarkable terrain, punching the same half-dozen enemies with B, jumping with A, and occasionally picking up coins or useless items. You can also unleash a super attack that clears the screen when this blue meter is full. Occasionally, you might find an optional upper or lower path, but I wouldn't count on it being useful, as there's almost never a benefit to straying off of the easiest way through. Each world has 3 levels in it, with the first one almost always being a walk and punch level, level 2 being an escort mission for some reason, and level 3 being an easy boss fight. I'll at least give the game credit for having checkpoints before the bosses and partway through some of the other levels. That way you can pick Donkey to start and speed through the level, and make jumps that Shrek sometimes just cannot make. Again, this is a well-designed game we're talking about here. And then die and switch to Shrek to rack up the damage against the bosses. The later levels put more of an emphasis on platforming, and these are where the game falls apart the most. Fleeing the castle as Shrek while sprinting away from the dragon is neat on paper, except you're just going back the exact same way you came in during the previous level, only faster and with a much higher chance of death. All in all, it's not the worst game on this list. Actually, it might be the best now that I really think about it, but there's really no reason to play it. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the best part of Hassle at the Castle is that it has a full level dedicated to out-singing a songbird. Released in July 2003, Shrek Wreaking Havoc is a direct sequel to Hassle at the Castle. You would think, considering Hassle was based on the first movie, that this would be a game based on Shrek 2, right? Nope, we've got ourselves a midquel. In this game's plot, Farquaad's ghost has risen from the grave and sworn revenge on Shrek and all of the fairy tale characters. That's a quote, by the way. This game even refers to its own world as if it was fiction, which is just mwah! In Wreaking Havoc, the only playable characters are Shrek and Fiona, who jumps from ogre in the opening cutscene to human for the rest of the game, because like hell they were going to create new sprite work. Donkey is nowhere to be found until the very end of the game, locked up in a cage by Farquaad's minions. On their way to take Farquaad down, Shrek and Fiona help Pinocchio become a real boy, save Candyland from rats, and help Peter Pan find his shadow, all before killing Farquaad's ghost and rendering him double dead. After that, the game sequel baits a third game that was never released because Take-Two acquired TDK and lost the Shrek license. Thanks, Take-Two. Mechanically, Wreaking Havoc is just Hassle at the Castle, but worse in every conceivable way. Instead of 10 coins rewarding you with an extra life like in the previous game, here you need 100 coins, and you'll only hit that every 2 or 3 levels if you're really trying. And the Gingy heads that acted as extra lives in Hassle are just gone now. Also gone is any semblance of platforming, thank God. Wreaking Havoc is now just a beat-em-up through and through, albeit with labyrinthine level design. To replace the platforming, the dev team threw in several optional paths in each level, most of which are dead ends. Some, if you're lucky, have these cages holding fairy tale characters, and freeing them adds to your score. Your score, naturally, does nothing, so all these optional paths do is waste your time, health, and maybe lives as you slowly shuffle through the dead ends. They even removed the run option from Hassle, and took out everything that made each character distinct. The only unique thing that Shrek can do now is lift items up the 2 or 3 times that's needed, and Fiona can grab swords and weapons for like 30 seconds before they just disappear. Mind you, the enemies are one-shots until the final 2 levels anyway, so those weapons do absolutely nothing. Oh, also, Shrek isn't playable for the first half of this game. If you thought Metal Gear Solid 2's bait and switch was bad, oh boy, you're in for a treat here. The game somehow even looks and sounds worse, with stock music replacing any of Hassle's tunes that sounded remotely Shrekly. The parallax scrolling somehow deteriorates even further, and the screen shakes just a little bit right at the peak of your jump arc, which just disorients you. The only thing that looks arguably better is the HUD, but even then there's this little number in the top right of the HUD that's just there. It's not your lives, it's never used at any point in the game, just what is that? I, for one, am glad this sub-series ended here, because based on its current trajectory, I can only imagine the third game would have been a straight-up dumpster fire.
Shrek 2 coincided with the film's release in mid-2004, and this time was published by Activision and developed by Vicarious Visions, who, if you're a fan of mine, you might know as the same guys behind most of the very good GBA and DS Tony Hawk's games. They also made one of my favourite GBA kart races with Crash Nitro Kart, so going into this one, I had somewhat higher expectations than usual, and while this isn't nearly as fantastic as those skating games or that racing game, Shrek 2 on the GBA is genuinely quite good. With Donkey Kong Country-style pre-rendered graphics, it naturally nails the feel of Shrek pretty well, though on the rare occasion I've had trouble distinguishing what's in the foreground and background. Like a lot of GBA movie tie-ins, it occasionally uses stills from the movie with some simple text underneath to tell the story, which also helps a bit with those sort of Shrek vibes. The whole shtick of the gameplay here is that you go through levels swapping between characters to use their strengths to beat puzzles and beat up enemies. And for the most part, this single player co-op thing it's going for is pretty good. good. Shrek can pick up large items and ground pound, Donkey can jump pretty high, Puss in Boots can cling to walls, it's all that sort of thing. Using a combination of 2 or 3 of the 5 characters, you generally need to figure out how to use one character to unlock a door for the other characters or to find a way to get them over an obstacle, and for the most part this is a pretty solid gameplay loop. Apparently, according to the internet at least, this is reminiscent of a really early Blizzard game called Lost Vikings, which did a similar thing. This shtick is interesting, but it does get quite repetitive over time. The characters move far too slow for my liking, which sucks when you have to control so many of them. The camera has its issues, and the levels are really long with no checkpoints, which is by far the worst thing about this game, but all things considered, Shrek 2 is surprisingly decent. Shrek 2 was followed up later in the same year with a game called Shrek 2 Beg for Mercy, and come on, it's called Beg for Mercy. The Shrek fanfic BDSM jokes just write themselves. The most interesting thing about this game is that it's actually, genuinely called Beg for Mercy. Goodbye my monetization. Anyway, moving on, this is also by Vicarious Visions, and it's obviously on the same engine as Shrek 2, but they've opted to make more of an action game than a puzzle game. Starring Puss in Boots, the game addresses my complaints about all the characters being really slow by having Puss be really agile with multiple attacks and a great double jump. But they've removed puzzles entirely, which I think was the most interesting thing about the last game, so it's a weird trade-off. I guess it's very much a preference thing. There are some really small quality of life improvements too, like now you don't need to press a button to pick up most items, which is small but has a big impact and makes the game flow a lot better. However, as you go along in the game, there are some levels where you play as Shrek or Donkey, and they control exactly the same as in the last game, which is really boring since you don't swap between characters at all in this. Before you could at least justify having boring character control with the whole swapping thing, but now it's just so one note and tiresome. But at least for the most part, you do play as Puss in Boots, so it ain't too bad. The story is still told through stills, though instead of being stills from the movie, they're these cleaner looking medieval drawings, which is pretty cool, and the game is still awful about checkpoints, and it does still have a really dodgy camera that's probably worse because you move quicker, but again, Shrek 2 BDSM is mostly quite fun, and I think it holds up slightly better than the original Shrek 2 game just because it controls nicer.
Shrek SuperSlam, released in October 2006, is a GBA port of a surprisingly fun console game. On console, SuperSlam is a 3D fighting game in the same vein as Power Stone, with arguably too much content for how simple the mechanics are. On the Game Boy Advance, SuperSlam is a 2D fighting game, and it is unsurprisingly not very fun at all. Playing as one of 10 different fighters, your goal is to smack your enemies enough to build up your slam meter. Using a slam attack is the only way to earn points and defeat enemies in most of the game's different modes. Now, in the console version, the fatal flaw was that the slam moves took up most of the screen and lasted for far too long, meaning that the game was a war of attrition most of the time. Whoever could build more slam meters by default would win. Here on the Game Boy, the slam moves simply replace the 2 moves you have when the meter is full, meaning that your next attack will be a slam no matter what. That's even true if you're holding one of the game's many different items. At the very least, the moves are avoidable since they're just another regular attack, or at least they would be if the game's hitboxes made any sense at all. If you're going in for an attack on an opponent, odds are you're gonna get hit too. Every character has a regular attack string with A and a short-ranged projectile with B, and can pick up items with L or block with R. In the story mode, you're limited to 6 characters, and whichever character you pick will tell the baby Dronkies a fantastical bedtime story with their own unique flourish. Most of them end with you fighting an evil witch, but Donkey's ends with you fighting Puss in Boots, which is a nice touch. What's not nice though are the cutscene visuals, because oh my god, these are nightmare fuel. When fighting against computer opponents, you're going to find pretty quickly that they are absolute garbage. They don't track well to you or other fighters, they can't avoid basic attacks, and they never block. And this is the final boss of Donkey's story, stuck for the entirety of the fight. However, usually one of the computers in a 4-player game is randomly chosen to be really good, and since the computers tend to get bunched together, that one gets so many kills that if you're not extra prepared, they will run away with the match. As a result, for most fights, your best bet is just to spam the launch move, because the computers will come right back down into the attack again and again. And of course, because this fighting game is balanced, there's no way to attack if you've been hit while in the air, so if you get launched, prepare for a good amount of frustrating waiting as you continue to get juggled. While it's not a great game mechanically, like the console version, it has way more content than it has any right to have. There are dozens of challenge missions with unique objectives, several unlockable characters and costumes, and both single-player and multiplayer game modes like King of the Hill and Team Battles. If the game were any fun, this would be a sleeper hit for the GBA, but with how up to chance the fights usually are, it's anything but fun. Alright, it's time for the absolute worst game on this list, Shrek Smash and Crash Racing. Released in November 2006, this game is also a downgraded port of a pretty decent console game. The GameCube Smash and Crash is still a poor man's Mario Kart, but it's far better than it had any right to be. The GBA release though, oh boy! I expected this to be a game in the same vein as Swamp Kart Speedway, but the developers opted to go for a top-down isometric sort of angle and push this version of Smash and Crash down the Micro Machines route, and it does not work whatsoever. The screen is too zoomed in and the character's too big for you to see what's coming ahead of you, which is fantastic when the items have some of the worst collision detection I've ever seen. Not only are the items also way too big, you don't even have to be near a trap to trigger it, so if a trap is placed right in the middle of a track, whoever passes it first is almost certainly going to trip it off. When you get hit, naturally, there's a very prolonged spin-out animation, which can be doubled or tripled in length seemingly arbitrarily. The thrown homing items, which in the console release were a bit too powerful, are pretty much useless here. Their tracking is just horrendous, leading them to run into walls before they hit any opponents unless you throw it right from point-blank range. And all of that is ignoring how slippery the controls are. This game has no acceleration, it's either full speed or a crawl, which is just fantastic. I never once felt in control of my racer for more than a few fleeting moments, because even the slightest tap of the D-pad sends you careening immediately 30 to 40 degrees. With how sharp the turns often are, and how often you'll be placed right near other racers, the title Smash and Crash is certainly appropriate here. Most tracks put up walls around the entire course so that you can't veer too hard out of the way, but some have grass on the edges to immediately slow you to a halt, or even worse, pools of water that will reset your character. Except it resets you pointing the same direction that you were just moving in, so if you don't turn sharply enough when you start moving, you'll go right back into the drink. Also, it's worth noting that even Donkey, who's riding on his flying dragon wife, will fall into the water, because of course this game doesn't make sense. I will say that it seems like the game has different stats for each player, as Shrek on his weird green Appa from Avatar The Last Airbender seemed to have significantly better traction than Gingy's candy car. But that could just be placebo or the alcohol talking. Smash and Crash has no multiplayer component, unlike its console counterparts, and the AI, despite being pretty terrible, is still too difficult simply because of how bad these controls are. I didn't place higher than 4th in any race, so I didn't see past the first of the game's 4 cups. It's strange that the game totally omits a difficulty option when the first Shrek Kart game had one of those despite being way too easy and released 4 years prior. The last thing I want to say is that like so many GBA games, this has a file select, as if you and your little brothers or sisters were going to play this game, let alone share it. I promise you that you'll be better off in life if you never play this game.
Finally, we have Shrek the Third, which came out in 2007, which is really late in the GBA's life cycle, at a time where most GBA games were just kids tie-in games like this one. This was also developed by Vicarious Visions, the same guys who did Shrek 2 and Beg for Mercy, so naturally, it controls and looks almost the same as those games, despite coming out 3 years later. It even uses recycled assets everywhere, which is something that this game just seems to like doing. Like Vicarious Visions also developed the Madagascar and Over the Hedge GBA games in a similar style, so they were just happy to go ahead and use those assets here with characters like the penguin, the hippo, and the turtle. Forgive me for not knowing their names. They're just sort of in the game to give advice on how to play, and for the most part they don't even acknowledge that they're from those other games or movies. At the start of the game, one of the penguins actually kind of acknowledges it, which I thought was kind of cute, but Jesus Christ, this is some lazy game making. Or maybe it's some efficient game making, depending on how optimistic you are. I mean, to be fair, this is a 2007 GBA Kids tie-in game. They didn't expect anyone to play it, but little did they know a man in his early 20s would roast it 11 years later on the internet. They've opted for a similar design to Shrek 2 with the switching characters and the puzzles, but being all rushed feeling, it's a lot less refined than Shrek 2 was with its level design, and obviously it doesn't quite capture the Shrek vibe nearly as well. Then again, neither did the Shrek 3 movie, so I guess it's doing a pretty good job. The game does get better as it goes along though. You get to play as Prince Charming, and the levels are still okay-ish, all things considered. They even let you swap between 4 characters in the one level sometimes, which is new, but really I'm not sure I have anything super positive to say about this. I mean, it's not bad or anything, it's quite standard, but there's just not a lot of value here, and if you're crazy enough to want to play something like this, you should just go back and play the less sloppy version of this, which is Shrek 2 GBA. And with that, we've covered all 8 Shrek games on the GBA. Hope that was informative, hope that was useful. There was also the GBA video, if you remember that thing, which released Shrek 1, Shrek 2, and a combo cartridge of both Shrek 1 and 2. Full movies on the GBA, but we're not going to cover those in this video because they're sort of hard to record and they're not games and this is about the games. But yeah, if you're wondering why we made a Shrek video, I'm going to pass it over to Bolt.
Hi everybody, that's me. I am the Bolt. For the past few years, right around this time of year, I've taken part in 2 Shrek-themed events. The aforementioned Shrektober, because again, I hate myself, but far more importantly, a charity drive called Going Overboard, where along with several others, I raise money for a wonderful charity called Child's Play by playing really bad games and encouraging people to donate. As you can see, we've just done exactly that bad games part. More info about Going Overboard and Child's Play can be found in various links that I'm sure many will put somewhere, and if you're interested, please check it out, donate, share stuff around, all that stuff. We're suffering through bad games for a couple days so that countless children hopefully don't suffer at all during lengthy hospital stays.
So yeah, as usual, thanks for watching, thanks to Bolt for being on this. Link to Bolt's channel in the description, link to charity in the description, link to everything in the description. Basically just go to the description, go to the comments, leave the video, do whatever you like. I'm just glad you got this far, really. I'm just glad you stuck it out watching us play all 8 of these terrible games. They're not that bad. No, they are. A lot of them are really bad. But yeah, thanks for watching. I already said that. Take it easy. Bye.